All right. Can you guys let me know if you can hear me? Welcome back, everyone. We are back after taking a month off of the John Vervaeke Watch Party series. Happy New Year. I know it's a bit of a rocky start to the year, but we've got some good news. We just had our first baby on December 9th. So, yeah, that's awesome news. And he's healthy. Everyone's happy. So we're excited. And with that in mind, Yuvi's actually going to be in the next room taking care of him while she's doing the notes. So the notes quality may decline. We'll see. Depends on how grumpy our kid is. So if this is your first time coming to this, the way this works is we will watch John Vervaeke's lecture series. I think he's got about 50 of these out, and we're on number 12 today. We watch them live together, and then after we do a video chat, which is also live streamed in the same place, and we just discuss what the content was about, and sometimes the conversation will go in different directions. That's all fine. We just kind of go with whatever feels good. So, and thanks for the congrats, everyone. So I think we're pretty much ready to go into this. Let me check. Yeah, okay. So the watch party, we do these every Monday at 9 a.m. We just had a month off, but we're getting back 9 a.m. PST and 5 p.m. GMT. We're getting back to it now, starting today, and then we're going to do this every week until we finish the series. As I mentioned, we do the show notes, and you can check those out at futurethinkers.org/meaningcrisisnotes, and that will forward you to a Google Doc. And then at the end of the video, the John Vervaeke lecture, we're going to do the discussion, but we'll take like a 10-minute intermission, and then I'll give the Zoom link for any of you guys who want to join. So I think that's it. We can get into this. Just give me a sec. All right, enjoy.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So we have been engaged in a very long discussion because we're talking about a topic that is central about the possibility of enlightenment and to try and make that something plausibly accessible to us rather than something wrapped and shrouded in mesmeric mystique. Instead, we've been trying to understand this from a cognitive science perspective that could tell us why these higher states of consciousness might in fact provide a means for the radical self-transformation, self-transcendence, enhanced inner peace and connectedness to reality that are the central legacy of the axial age revolution and that are still needed today, even if we no longer believe in the mythology of the axial age religions and philosophies. How do we find a place to vouchsafe the value, the precious value that these states can confer on lives in terms of meaning and transcendence when we no longer can understand and articulate and legitimate that in terms of a two worlds mythology? So if you remember, we had been discussing the properties of these higher states of consciousness. We had discussed what the world is like. It's a bright, both comprehensive and detailed, intricate and interesting, the world in a grain of sand. It's highly intelligible, it's beautiful, and behind it is a pervasive sense of oneness. The self that is resonating with that world in the higher state of consciousness is a self deeply at peace, like in Plato's description of anagoge. It's experiencing joy. It's experiencing a kind of deep remembrance, sati, of the being mode, its true and authentic self. It is losing its egocentrism. We talked about the connectedness between the self and the world as one so intimate, so flowing, so anagogic, that the sense of participation and conformity is achieving a sense of identity, deep and profound, being at one with the oneness. But that it is so profound that it is almost always described as ineffable. We then took a look at what might be going on in these states, because we're trying to remember, we're trying to give a descriptively adequate and a prescriptively adequate account. We took a look at the continuity hypothesis, that the same machinery that's at work in our everyday experience of the fluency of reading into the moments of insight, into the insight cascades of flow, and then being exapted even more into mystical experience. And then some of those mystical experiences bring about a quantum change, right? They bring about a deep transformative experience. And I suggested to you, I proposed to you that what's going on in these higher states of consciousness is something like a state of flow, but that the skill, the expertise that is flowing is not this particular skill of rock climbing or being a martial artist or playing jazz. It's the skill, the domain general skill of getting an optimal grip on the world. And so what's happening is people are getting a flow state in their ability to optimally grip on the world. This connection to the machinery of insight helps to explain why disruptive strategies are used in order to try and bring about the higher states of consciousness, because disruptive strategies are so central to trying to create insight. They're both naturally disruptive strategies, and you can acquire them through mindfulness psychotechnologies. We were examining what these disruptive strategies do. They massively increase variation in your processing, and that reveals invariants, both good invariants. You get to see more of the real patterns that are remaining unchanged through all the variation. That's what science does. Across all of their variations, we try to find the real patterns that are invariant. And what science does is increase the variation. We run experiments. We increase the variation. We do all kinds of manipulations and increased variations to try and find what remains invariant, because we take that to point out to us what is more real. That's what you're doing. But it also, so it's opening up the invariance of the world. And you're using the flow state's capacity for enhanced implicit processing, implicit learning of complex patterns, tracking of causal patterns to do that. But it's also picking up on the bad invariance. It's picking up on, it's helping to reveal all the ways in which you are systematically misframing. So that like a child going through a developmental stage, and I would point to you to the work of my former student and friend, colleague Junsun Kim, for this idea of development as a systematic form of insight, something that he and I are working on together. Like a child going through a developmental stage, realizing not just this error or that error, but a systematicity in the way that they're misframing reality and finding a nexus, a point of where the insight, is not just an intervention in this problem, but in a whole class and type of problems. That developmental change of seeing through illusion and into reality that is so central to wisdom is also being afforded by these higher states of consciousness. What about the decentering that's so central to both flow, mystical experiences, and then ultimately to higher states of consciousness? My colleague, Igor Grossman, has produced quite a bit of good experimental evidence that such decentering strategies, although this was prefigured in earlier work by the Berlin paradigm, Igor Grossman has done some excellent work on showing that such decentering strategies are very relevant for bringing about wisdom. He has work on what he calls the Solomon effect. Let me describe it to you, and you'll see why these disruptive, decentering strategies can be so powerful. Get people to find a problem that's very messy, problematic, and that they're stuck in. Usually it's an interpersonal problem, because as Sartre said, hell is other people. So is heaven, by the way. He didn't say that. But our deepest and most pervasive problems are generally problems with other people. Why? Because the thing that is, I've mentioned this before, that is most predictive of how meaningful your life is your meaningful relationships to others. The problem is human beings are endlessly complex. Okay? So you're describing this interpersonal problem, and when people describe it, they are, of course, mesmerized by the mirage of their own egocentric perspective. They describe it without thought, default, from the first-person perspective, and they remain stuck. Remember this notion of stuckness. We'll come back to it again when we talk about Gnosis and Gnosticism. Then you get the person to re-describe the same problem from the third-person perspective. You get them to decenter. What will often happen is they will break frame. They will realize a way in which they have been blocked, systematically locked in not solving their problem. They'll often have a central insight into how to resolve their problem. This is why it's called the Solomon effect, because it tends to make you more wise. Think about the radical decentering that's going on in these awakening experiences, in these higher states of consciousness. Notice the systematicity of the error of egocentrism. It's not an error in this problem, or this problem, or this problem. It's a systematic error. That's why it's often described with metaphors of like being asleep. Because when you wake up, you have a systematic change in your consciousness. So what's happening in these higher states of consciousness, in these awakening experiences, you're getting a transformation, an intervention in systematic error. You're seeing through illusion precisely because of the powerful decentering that they are affording for you. Now that, of course, can be a powerfully traumatic experience. It can be a terrifying experience. Pursuing this in an autodidactic fashion, like all autodidactic, being a completely self-taught, right, is very, very dangerous. Autodidacts tend to get into echo chambers, vicious circles of their own egocentric entombment and entrapment. The Buddha gives a wonderful parable about this. He says, this is how you catch a monkey. You put some pitch on a piece of wood, and it looks like something very shiny and tasty. It's salient, it's attractive. And so the monkey grabs it with its hand, and it gets stuck. And then it uses its other hand to try and free itself, and it gets stuck. So it uses its right foot, and then its left foot, and then it puts its head, its mouth on, and then it's completely trapped, and then the hunter comes and kills it. Okay? But decentering can alleviate that. But if you are still pursuing this as an isolated individual, as an autodidact, then think about how ill-prepared, unskilled, untutored, and egocentrically you are trying to confront this radical transformation. That is why I think it is a very poor idea for people to take psychedelics without having them placed within a wisdom tradition in which they have a committed community that can give outside, decentering, and wise advice for how to process and handle these transformations. But once again, I point to you to an aspect of the meaning crisis. We have institutions of information, we have institutions of knowledge, we have traditions, and we have respected experts who give us guidance. We do not have this for wisdom. Now, what is amazing, of course, is that some individuals like Siddhartha are able to do it as individuals. I want to point out two things about that. They deserve our admiration for successfully doing it as individuals, even though the Buddha had training from other people all along the way. But we should not take from that some kind of promotion of our North American individualism. Because the Buddha made it very clear that the Sangha, or the community, was necessary for the cultivation of these transformative states. So, you've got this radical decentering. It can afford wisdom. And I want to try and show you how it's not just a perspectival knowing, it's not just a radical transformation in our salience landscape. This is a participatory change. This involves not just the machinery of cognition or the machinery of consciousness. This alters the machinery of the self, and therefore is also fundamentally a transformation of character. Remember, participatory knowing is knowing by conforming. Well, the radical at oneness of these brings about a radical kind of participatory knowing. Right? We'll come back to this when we return and talk about Plotinus. But right, it's so beautiful precisely because the coupling is so profound. And think about, you're getting reciprocal revelation. The world is revealing itself more deeply, and more depths of yourself are being revealed in a coupled fashion. Well, That's love. Love is mutually accelerating disclosure. If you want somebody, if you want to fall in love with somebody, although you can never sort of pursue it that way, I think. But what happens is if you get two people mutually disclosing from each other in a coupled fashion, I honestly disclose something about myself, and then you in response disclose. And then I pick that up and disclose more, and then you disclose. That reciprocal, enhanced, mutual conforming engenders love. And love is something you know by participating in it, like your culture and your language. This is knowing by loving. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that some recent cognitive science research can give us some understanding about why this decentering and this transformation of the sense of self might be functional here. There's a lot of work. I would recommend to you the work of Suey and Humphrey from 2015, for example, showing that one of the functions of yourself, right, not your mind, but yourself, is to act as glue. This is a term they use. It's a metaphor. By making things relevant to myself, I can make them relevant to each other and glue them together. So, and I'm always doing that, right? I'm simultaneously gluing things together as I'm gluing myself together. What the self is a powerful set of functions for integrating, actually complexifying processing. To say you have a self is to say you have a systematic set of functions that are integrating, not homogenizing, complexifying things together. Now, if you remember, we talked about the work of Michael Anderson, acceptation, the acceptation of the tongue. Here's a proposal to you. This powerful machinery that is central to your cognitive agency, your ability to make sense of the world by gluing the world together as you're gluing yourself together, this powerful machinery of complexification of information and information processing can be exapted. What if you were to take all that machinery of integration that you're using to integrate yourself and you turned it onto the world? What if you took all of that capacity to glue things together and you exapted it on the world? Well, that would mean that machinery that was normally self-focused about integrating the self and integrating its processing could be used to achieve a deeper integration of the world, to reveal deeper underlying patterns. Vervaeke in 96, Glaxton in 2000, both suggest, with argumentation and with phenomenological evidence, and many reports from people who are undergoing mystical experiences seem to corroborate this, that what seems to happen is all of the energy and machinery that has been bound up in our self has been turned onto the world. That's why the world comes alive to us, and we see so deeply into it. Imagine the intimacy you have in your self-knowledge being turned on to the world. So all of that energy that's stored up in your egocentric processing, all the time and the resource, and all the, who am I? What's going on? Oh, how's it? Oh, how's this? Well, relevant. All of that. Imagine if you could take that machine and say, forget about John Vervaeke. Just for a while, even. Turn it on. Turn all that massive machine onto the world. Radical decentering, I propose to you, is doing exactly that. All of the time and effort and processing and skill and memory and structures that we've built into our ego can be exapted to disclose the world. And that, of course, would be coupled with a radical sense of moving into the being mode and a radical sense of remembering who and what we really are. So, what I've tried to show you is we can understand the higher cognitive process at the psychological level in terms of this decentering, the exaptation of the self machinery, flowing optimal grip, right? Enhanced awareness of invariance, both in the positive sense and in the ability that allows us to pick up on systematic error. We can see why this machinery is operating and producing the experiential profile it is producing. What about at the information processing level? I don't want to get very technical here, but this is the level at which we turn to work that's being done in machine learning, artificial intelligence, where people are actually trying to make machines that make sense of the world. And what kind of strategies do they come up with for trying to get the machines to be better learners? Well, one interesting thing is precisely the use of disruptive strategies. So Woodward et al. In 2014, this is a direct quote from them, right? I'll give you the quote in a sec. They introduced randomization into a neural network. A neural network is a very powerful and cutting-edge form of artificial intelligence that in some important ways mimics how brains work. And when you're training these neural networks, you don't program them, you train them to learn for themselves, right? But very often what you have to do is you have to introduce noise, entropy, randomness into these networks. In fact, he goes on to say that such randomness, quote, is an essential aspect of the self-optimization process. You have to, these are not people doing psychology, these are not people trying to understand higher states of consciousness. What they're trying to do is they're trying to make neural networks that learn better, that can self-optimize, and what they do, what they say is essential, that's the word he used, to this is disruption, disruptive strategies. Why? See, the problem with powerful machines is they pick up on patterns. And you say, well, but John, that's good. Isn't picking up patterns good? Well, remember all the stuff we've talked about when we talked about implicit learning and picking up on only correlational patterns, not picking up on real patterns. See, the problem you face is you're always sampling from the world. So here's your experience, and then here's the world. And there's some pattern in your experience. And what you want to know is that pattern in the world or not? We invented a whole discipline to deal with this. It's called statistics. All statistics is basically this problem. How do I know if the patterns in my sample are the same as the patterns in the world? How do I know that? Right? So, for example, if I was in class at U of T and let's say it's an even huge class, 500 students, Psych 100, and I say, how many people here think that student tuition should be reduced or schools should be free? And they all put up their hands. Should I then conclude, look, the overwhelming majority of people think that student tuition should be reduced? You'd say, that's ridiculous, and this is what you should say, because that is not a representative sample. The pattern there is all students. You need the sample to have the same patterns as the environment. So why is that relevant to disruption? Very often, what will happen with these neural networks is they will overfit to the data. They will too tightly pick up on the pattern in the sample, a pattern that does not generalize to the rest of the world. So let me give you a way of understanding this graphically. So very often, right, we're like, you've been probably taught this, right? You do a scatter plot, you point your point, right? And then you don't typically draw a line like this to try and capture the data. Instead, what we typically do is a line of best fit, which might not touch any of the data points. This is called data compression, the line of best fit. Why do we do that? We do that in science because what we're trying to find is the function that will generalize, that will go to all kinds of different contexts, that will not be true just of this sample, but will be true of the population. But what the networks do is they do this. They overfit to the data. They track a function that perfectly describes the sample, but does not generalize to the population. Precisely because they're so powerful, they overfit. So what do? Well, you can throw some noise into the system. You can turn off, you can do dropout, you can turn off half of the nodes. You basically disrupt the processing a lot. Because what the disruption does is it prevents you from overfitting to the data, and it actually allows you to compress. And what does the compression do? It allows you to find the real invariants, the real patterns that will generalize across all the varying contexts. Now, of course, right, you don't want to underfit. If you underfit, then you're not picking up on any patterns at all. So notice again, these systems have to toggle. They have to toggle back and forth. They have to disrupt, right? Very analogous to breaking frame in order so they can make a better frame. And they're trying to find that sweet spot between disruptive variation and compression to detect real patterns that allows them to become good learners. So what we know is that, again, you have to have disruptive strategies set within powerful pattern detection. That's exactly what we're seeing at work, as I mentioned to you, in these people that are pursuing these higher states of consciousness. It's also, again, why belonging to a tradition that can afford powerful pattern detection, introduce disruption when needed, and guide you to help toggle to find the sweet spot is very, very important. If you want to be really good at jamming, and you have to have the requisite skill. Jamming without jamming without skill just gives you junk, doesn't give you jazz. So what's going on in the brain? So notice what I'm showing you here. The machines are doing, right, the compression. That compression is, right, that toggling of attention that you see going on in the higher state of they're disrupting and then compressing, and they're trying to find the huge invariance patterns, but they're trying to break frame, and they're doing stuff that seems, I think, plausible to say is analogous to what we see going on at the psychological level within people. What about at the brain level? Well, this is where we have to turn to Newberg, because he's done most of the work on tracking brains as people are having these kinds of experiences. And what you see is, right, initially you get increased activity in the frontal area and the parietal area. These are the two areas, the frontal-parietal connection, that is most associated with your general intelligence, your ability to make sense and get an optimal grip on the world, because that's what your general intelligence is. So initially you see these areas get hyperactive, and then you see the opposite. You see them hypoactive. So huge increase followed by a huge decrease. Now, throughout, you have throughout all of this, this is the frontal parietal, you have enhanced activity in the thalamus. This is the area of the brain that tries to integrate all kinds of different information together. The greater the shift, the greater the disruptive shift, the more powerful the awakening experience is. It's just like what's going on in insight. You initially bring all this machinery to bear to frame it, and then you have to massively disrupt it and break it. And then the system self-organizes, and that is precisely what's going on, I would suggest to you, in these experiences. So, what is happening in the brain, for example, in psychedelic experiences, is you'll often see this kind of shift. What's important, and there's a bunch of people doing work on this, metastability. So what, for example, psilocybin does, according to recent work done by Lord et al., is it increases metastability in the brain. So if you look at the work of Kelso, Tognoli, and others, what metastability is a state in the brain that's doing this complexification I talked about. So normally your brain is integrating things or segregating, integrating, differentiating. But in psilocybin, what you get is a state called metastability where, and this is a state in which the brain is simultaneously integrating and segregating. It is massively complexifying. Please remember, complexification is when a system is both integrating and differentiating. When you went from being a zygote to being a biologically complex organism, your cells were differentiating into different types of cells, liver cells, eye cells, etc., but they were also integrating. You are complex because you're both highly integrated and highly differentiated. Complexification gives you emergent functions. It gives you new abilities. You can do things as a person, right, a biological human being, that you couldn't do as a zygote precisely because you're complex. Look, emergent functions come to the fact, because I'm highly differentiated, I can do many different things, but because I'm highly integrated, I don't fall apart as a system by doing these many different things. I get new emergent abilities. The way you grow and self-transcend as a system is by complexifying. Psilocybin, by putting you into metastability, right, helps your brain complexify and come up with emergent abilities. It allows you to see the world, massive integration, in a grain of sand, massive differentiation. So I think what we can see here is, at least highly plausible, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in just a minute, account at the psychological level, at the machine processing level, and at the brain level of what is going on in these higher states of consciousness and why they are so powerfully optimizing your cognitive functionality. Once again, not to repeat this, but that, of course, has to be placed within the proper sapiential context. You need a tradition and institutions, a committed community of cultivating wisdom. Now, what about the prescriptive argument? I've laid a lot of the groundwork for this. Why should we listen to people who have been in this state? Why should this state serve as the justification for a transformation of your life? If someone comes up to you and says, I want you to transform your life according to X, Y, Z, right? You need that claim justified, not just described and explained, you need it justified. What would make it a good thing to do? Are these states actually good guides for transformation? Well, in order to do that, I need to introduce a notion to you first. We're going to come back to this notion again when we talk about the nature of cognitive science. Although I've been exemplifying a lot of cognitive science to you throughout these previous videos. This is the notion of plausibility. We need to talk about this because plausibility is central to your notion of how real things are. Now, there's two senses of the word plausible. One is a synonym for highly probable. That's not the sense I'm using. I'm using it in the sense that Rescher and others made famous, where this means makes good sense. Stands to reason. Right? Should be taken seriously. Most of the time, and I'll make this point in detail in a few minutes, you cannot base your actions on certainty, but you have to rely on plausibility. Now, there's a lot of work on plausibility, and I'm just going to try to sketch to you what I think, or work I'm doing with Leo Ferraro and Anderson Todd, about trying to integrate work by Lombardi and Nashman and Sinatra from 2015, Kyle 2006, Milgram 1997, Rescher, I should say. There's just a lot of different work going into this. Here's what I think it is to make something plausible. First of all, it involves what Rescher calls trustworthiness. I think there's an important way in which trustworthiness comes about. You can see this in some of the work that Kyle has done on explanations we prefer. We regard a particular proposal or a construct or some way of trying to model the world as trustworthy if it's been produced by many independent but converging lines of evidence. Let me give you a clear, concrete example. Right? You will regard as more real information that comes through multiple senses as opposed to one sense. If I'm only seeing something, there's a good chance that it's an illusion or a delusion caused by the subjectivity of my seeing. But if I can see it and touch it and hear it and smell it, then the chance is that each one of those independent senses are, right, producing an illusion is radically diminished. The fact that they all are telling me the same thing, now that doesn't give me certainty, but it gives me trustworthiness. It reduces the probability, that's what trustworthiness is, right? It reduces the probability that I'm self-deceived. Now, that's not the same thing as certainty, because, unfortunately, for example, there is a form of schizophrenia in which people not only hear voices, but they see people attached to those voices, and when they reach out to touch the person, they get a tactile illusion. And it's very hard to convince those people that their illusions aren't real, precisely because this is highly trustworthy. This is why science likes numbers. We like numbers because they allow us to converge the senses. Look, you can see 3. You can touch 3. 1, 2, 3. You can hear 3. We like numbers not because we're fascists or something in science. We like numbers because numbers, quantification, help us to increase the trustworthiness of our information gathering. They allow us to reduce the chance that what we're getting, what we're measuring, what we're modeling is being produced by self-deception. Is that enough for plausibility? I don't think so. So we're converging to some processing state here. But we also want something to be the case, because we're not just looking backwards into how we got there, we're also looking forward what we can do with it. What we want, right, is we want a model that we can now apply to many new domains that will open up the world for us, that's multi-apt, right? This is like, again, taking a martial arts stance. I don't use this, but I'm taking this stance because I can quickly adapt it to many different situations. It's multi-apt. It's highly functional. So why do I want this, right? When I can use the same model in many different places, this is, I would argue, what people mean when they say a theory or a model is elegant. You can use the same model, right? It's adaptive enough, it's multi-apt that you can use it in many different places and apply it. So you have convergence for trustworthiness, but you have elegance for power, for multi-aptness, for multi-apt application. Is that enough? No, right? I think this state has to be highly fluent to you. Remember we talked about this. This has to be one that you can use readily, powerfully for yourself, that you can internalize. When you have this, when you have fluency, convergence, elegance, right, you need one more thing. You need a balance between the convergence and the elegance. If I have a lot of convergence without much elegance, that's triviality. The thing about trivial statements is not that they're false, they're true, but they're not powerful. They don't transform. Many times we reject things, we don't take them seriously, they don't make good sense to us, precisely because they're trivial. What's the opposite? Very little convergence with a lot of promise of power. This is when things are far-fetched. Conspiracy theories have this feature. If they were true, they would explain so much. If we would just accept that the British royal family were lizard beings from outer space, we could explain so much of their behavior. But the problem is, although that would be a very powerful explanation, we have very little trustworthy evidence that that is in fact the case. So what we want is we want that, as Milgram says, our backward commitments and our forward commitment match. We only commit powerfully forward if we've got a lot of trust in the model that we've produced. When all of this is in place, right, I think we find what we're processing not only fluent, we find it highly plausible. When we have very deep convergence and very deep elegance and very efficient fluency, I think we then find the proposal profound. So you're saying, why are you going on about this? Because what I'm trying to show you is what the brain is doing is performing a kind of evaluation of the plausibility of its processing when it's in a higher state of consciousness. See this model? What did we see? What did we see? We saw lots of things going into the higher state of consciousness. We saw de-automatization, right? We saw decentering. All of these things are strategies for reducing bias. Reducing bias. These are all strategies for reducing bias, right? De-automatization, decentering, fluency in processing. The state that you're in is a state of flowing optimal grip. It's intrinsically valued. It's optimizing for processing. And what's this affording, this state? Well, you're finding a nexus for development. You're finding that systematic error. You're getting that complexification of your processing. So you're getting emergent new functions. You're getting the exaptation of machinery, the insight machinery and the self machinery into new abilities. You see what I'm arguing? Your brain is in a state in which it's getting information that's saying this processing is deeply trustworthy, deeply powerful, deeply fluent, therefore profoundly plausible. Now, plausibility is not certainty, but plausibility is what we have to rely on. What do I mean by that? You can't get certainty for almost all of your processing. You have to rely on plausibility all the time. Well, you say, but I could turn to science. Science will give me certainty. Well, first of all, pay attention to the history of science. When has it ever done that? Almost all of the theories that have been proposed in science have ultimately turned out to be false in some significant or an important way. Science isn't believed in because it gives us certainty or facts. Science is believed in because it gives us self-correcting plausibility. Look, this is how do I decide what hypothesis to test? I don't test any hypothesis I come up with. I wonder if clipping my toenails will reduce famine in the Sahara. Let's test it out. I wonder if I gather enough frogs together, can I influence the Australian election? Let's test it out. Do you know how many hypotheses? And you say to me, that's what? Ridiculous. That's absurd. What you're saying to me is those hypotheses don't make sense. They don't deserve to be taken seriously. What you're saying to me is I reject them because they're implausible. Now I go into my experiment. I'm going to run an experiment in science. Well, what do I have to do? I have to control for alternative explanations. What we're always doing in science is inference to the best explanation. This goes to the work of Peter Lipton and others, right? Here's some phenomena. What I do is I have some candidate explanations for what's causing the phenomena. And then what I do is I put them into competition with each other. Which one of my hypotheses best explains it? And the one that best explains it, right, is chosen as what's real. But this, how would you make this certain? The way you would make this deductively certain is you would have to check all possible explanations. How many possible explanations are there? An infinite number. You can't ever make science certain because you're always doing this. This explanation is only as good as the competition it beats. In science, you advance by coming up with plausible alternative explanations that you beat with yours. Science depends on plausibility judgments. It depends on plausibility judgments when we choose our hypothesis. It depends on plausibility judgments when we choose what variables we're going to control for in experiments. It depends on plausibility judgments once we're done and we have the data and we have to interpret it. What is the number of interpretations I can give for any data? Infinite in number. What do? I generate the most plausible interpretation. Before the experiment, during the experiment, and after the experiment, I'm relying on plausibility. Plausibility is indispensable. That's why your brain looks for it. So notice what we've got. This higher state of consciousness is an optimization of your processing. It brings about a state of high plausibility, and it's relying on processes that are fundamental, right? Because optimization has priority. I have to get my optimal grip before I can judge what it is. I have to zero in on the relevant information and have the right formulation of my problem before I can try and answer it. These higher states of consciousness, notice what I'm saying they have indispensability because they run in terms of your plausibility machinery. They are optimal in terms of getting the best possible functioning for you. They are prior because they are fundamental to any and all of your cognitive processing. Getting this optimal grip, toggling between trade-offs, getting the best relationship between generalizing and discriminating. All of these have priority. These are why these states are such good guides. Again, if they're set within a set of sapiential practices, set within a sapiential tradition. Now, what I'm saying is these higher states of consciousness are great guides on how to transform yourself, how to cultivate wisdom, how to see through self-deception. But sometimes people come back from these states and they make pronouncements about the nature of the world. Sometimes these are bizarre. People will come back from DMT and tell them that hyperspace elves have told them that they should remain in forever inside their head or some bizarre stuff. Here's the thing you should know about. The propositions that people generate from this are largely useless. You can read these reports. People will have these higher states of consciousness, and one group of people will come out and say, I know there's a God. Other people have these experiences and they come out and they're filled with joy and they say, I know there's no God. Diametrically opposite. Because this isn't about propositional knowing. This is about participatory transformation. This isn't about getting secret metaphysical knowledge. This is about getting wise practices, wise transformations. Ultimately, what we need to do is to take the wisdom from these higher states of consciousness and get it into rational discourse with an independently established, via our best science, metaphysics, best science and philosophy. When we can put those two together, then we will have properly salvaged what these higher states of consciousness can afford for us. Do not confuse the rationality of wisdom with the rationality of knowledge. So next time what I want to do is, now that we've got a preliminary account of what these higher states of consciousness, what the awakening of the Buddha might have been plausibly like, we can return to what did he propose specifically, thereby finishing off the axial revolution, our discussion, I should say, of the axial revolution in India, and then we will return back to the Mediterranean world and look at what was happening there after Aristotle. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, guys. Thanks for coming in and watching John Vervaeke's lecture series with us. We're going to take 10 minutes off, and then we're going to come back and do the discussion. If you want to participate in the discussion, go to futurethinkers.org/discuss, I believe. Yeah. And so I'm going to start that right now, and then you guys can enter into a waiting room, and then after the 10 minutes, I'll let everyone in, and we can start the discussion. If you just want to watch, you can stay here and just watch the stream on the YouTube channel. See you in 10. Hey everyone, how's it going? We're starting. All right. Can you all hear me? Good, cool. Interesting back into this after the month off. Some time to process some things. Yeah, I think I'll throw it to you, David. Of course.
I think, well, let's see. So it's interesting too to have a break in the middle of the higher states of consciousness between the part one and part two. I think I liked some of the comments in the thread as we were watching. It was quiet this week. There was the recognition of the way that we orient around plausibility and around like that diagram that he shows of the various inputs, multiple things coming in, converging on one central thing, and that having multiple applicability, that bidirectional tree thing, the roots and the branches of that, is something, I was having a conversation yesterday, and it's something that you'll even see Vervaeke do a lot in later lectures. He kind of constantly uses that motion. And that's kind of the heart of relevance realization. So I think it's beautiful that he brings that up specifically here. And the notion of breaking frame, it's interesting because there's this is my own perspective that I'm bringing into this, but there's something of developmentally, when you're growing up, the kinds of things that you superstitiously believe, mistaking correlation for causation, maps your world in a certain way. You have a naive view of the meaning of things and the relationship of things, and then you regularly break frame in ways when you discover, oh, that's not the case, and now the trunk, that mode that you're in between is shown to be no longer plausible, right? Oh, that doesn't work anymore, and so now that falls away and something else has to come. But in a way, it goes down deeper into a sense of applicability from the potential, the combinatorially explosive possible causes and the applicability of that. So that's kind of the progression of development over time that happens already. And the fact that we need a sangha or a culture that helps us keep ourselves from deceiving ourselves, with occasional exceptions like the Buddha or somebody who seems to be able to do this individually, is also profound. And I think that one of the things that I love about this meaning crisis right here and right now is that we're at a point where we need a sangha and we're woefully undertrained. What we believe is the case, as you can see, I mean, it's not just a few people out there who believe in flat earth view of the world, right? We all have a belief in something that is plausible functional for a day-to-day existence and getting by. And yet you look deeper and you say, oh, it's actually not sufficiently complex for where we're headed to. This is the level of congruent convergence and applicability in the world that we're moving in, and the collective intelligence, our real deep collective intelligence and artificial intelligence and social media world where we're much more dynamic and everyone has access to the internet. It's no longer sufficiently complex with the small, with the way that we put our model of the world together. There's one other piece of this that I also have just recently had a deeper insight on, and that's that bidirectional tree aspect of that. I'm hoping that it's the same, that it's the left side for you guys as well. That inputting things that are converging, and the applicability of those, when we get to a point of sufficient common practice, the inputs mostly go away, and we narrow that down to very few things. So we believe certain propositions. Our propositional layer will suffice for inputs. So we hallucinate much of what we think is true in the world, and it's one of the reasons why you can argue with the flat earther all day. They're not paying attention to the inputs anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can argue with someone of a different political party. They're not actually paying attention to the inputs. They're paying attention to the propositions and applying those propositions in one direction. And that's not a fallacy. That's not a problem. That's actually the design, I think, to some extent, of coming up with those propositions. And then finding a way to break frame. And it's also, we resist, I made the comment in the video, we resist throwing those away because those are hard won. Those are things that we want to know about the world. And if they're applicable, if we find that they're applicable, we want to keep using those, because it's very expensive to come up with new hypotheses. What's relevant? What is plausible? What do I test? And it's only when we're sure that, okay, wait a minute, there's a problem, or when we throw ourselves in a higher state of consciousness from some other methodology, that we can kind of loosen that, break it, and start to notice, oh, wait a minute, there's a new kind of sense making that I have on this, and I can start a new round of testing to see, does this actually pass the test of plausibility? I'll pause there. I think that's a kind of a good frame of the overview of what I get out of this talk today.
You said that the flat earthers are cutting off the sensory level or something along those lines, correct? Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I think it is a combination looking at the sovereignty model, or the perception, sense-making agency, or input, processing, output. The output that they've come to is this conclusion that the world is flat, and the processing and the perception seem to be corrupt in this. And it seems to be related to this, both this, we've talked about it in the course, this desire to have something a certain way, and then also getting meaning from it being that certain way, getting meaning from maybe the community that flat earthers get, or the kind of camaraderie that they get from identifying with that position. But it's I kind of mean to say that it's two things. It's the sense making and the perception corrupting. And I think Vervaeke puts it really interestingly when he says, when he talks about plausibility versus certainty, we act as if we know for sure what is only most plausible. And I can't, this one's really challenging, coming up against smart people who act as if science is certain, because they argue based off of this kind of foundational set of assumptions and principles, and cannot be moved on those things because science proved it. Yeah, that's it for me.
I want to note, I just looked down and saw the comment in the YouTube video. Somebody said, just hallucinated you wiggling your fingers, eh? It's like, and there's a common sense notion. The plausible thing is, no, you actually saw me wiggle my fingers, and I wiggle my fingers. And I know, Mike, you're also reading Donald Hoffman and The Case Against Reality. And the degree to which I mean hallucination is something more than what, it's not that you're hallucinating that there's a person over here and there's a person over here. It's like, this is the degree to which we associate what's happening in the arena and what I'm perceiving has a high degree of correlation. It's a very high resolution hallucination that has lots of agreeability. It's not to say the hallucination is that there's not something over here that's happening. But it is to say that the interpretation of what you see happening over here is based on your experience. Like, you have a brand new baby, and brand new baby just born doesn't see much of the world at all like we do. They're pre-programmed to see certain things and start building correlation between what's happening and what it means over time. And we, culture, instantiate them to perceive that in a way that agrees with the way that we see it. So it is a very powerful kind of a hallucination. I don't mean to say that, oh, you're seeing something that I'm not seeing, or that it doesn't have any correlation to the world. But but the degree to which we trust it is, for day-to-day purposes, perfect. Don't need to worry about this. I'm going to buy a gallon of milk, or most things in your day-to-day. But if you're dealing with quantum mechanics or relativity, or things at the extremes, or particular shifts in cultural awareness, you really need to pay attention. You need to know that, as certain as you are, you're going on a plausibility model. You're not going on a certainty model, which isn't the essence of what I mean by hallucinating.
When you brought that up about what the baby is finding relevant and what he's learning to find salient and relevant, it's interesting because you can't separate the feedback of what we're teaching him from what is naturally evolved to unfold on its own. Like, for example, the eye contact thing. Like, he's now learning to make eye contact. And at first it was just kind of random looking around, but there's this feedback mechanism that I've just noticed. He's not just suddenly becoming aware of eyes and that they're relevant. We also change our expression when he makes eye contact, and we give him this sort of feedback that he's doing something we really like. And, we make noises and kind of interact with him more when he does that. So it's interesting, this sort of idea of certainty, that what you observe in the world is where you can base your truth, when it's not like that. There's so much feedback mechanism. I guess that's what John's been saying the whole lecture series. There's so much that we get from culture and from interaction that feeds our whole sense making and perception model. And it's really hard to differentiate between the two.
Yeah. I also think it's really beautiful with the raising of children, right? And the notion of love. Early in the lecture, John talked about love as what did he say? The mutually reinforcing disclosure, or whatever. That the sense of, oh, there is something, and I am being forthright and revealing about what's happening for me, and telling you what's happening, and curious about what's happening for you, and we're sharing that with each other. And there's a deepening, that same kind of a thing is happening, saying that this is salient. This is a salient connection. This is a salient relationship. And I have also, over the holiday, since in the month of December, been looking at the confusion of love. We haven't, let's see, I forget. I don't think that John's gotten to the lecture on agape, and yeah, no, that comes later. That's a future lecture. But there's something of the notion of unconditional love, right? That a parent has for a child, and I look at it and I think, it's interesting. It's also evolutionarily beneficial. It's not quite unconditional. It has. I mean, there is something like, right? There's like the hormones work to reinforce those eye contact salience features that we're teaching, and we get dopamine and oxytocin hits, and the baby does too when that happens. So we're having massive reinforcement for certain kinds of activity. And when he talks about, as we mature, the ability to turn that, the machinery of love and attention to the world, to really deeply perceive the world and have that kind of a relationship, brings life to the world as well. That's a really interesting notion, and I think it's important to recognize that. I'm gonna bring in my own view here again. There's something of the conventional sense of what we have for a mode of survival, which is get a job and just follow along a program, which is not that. Rely just on the policies that we've already established, and those are good enough. We're not really, and answer the questions that we're only paying you to answer. So there's some massive reduced focus on collective, on your tribe or your company or your family's perspective on focusing on what's important. That somehow misses a deep question of real what is the invariant part of you, right? There's something like, I want to really break frame. I want to use my life to break frame in such a way that I find the invariant of what is it that I'm meant to bring. Not just what gets me monetary feedback from my tribe, but what is the specific thing that I know is the thing that I'm here to bring. And there's a conversation we had recently where, when I get down to it, I am the only authority who can really plausibly speak on what is authentically mine to express, right? And at the same time, there's an overwhelming machinery to listen to the tribe, what the tribe wants from me as well. So there's an individuation process that's happening there as well. It feels like a stretch to move it beyond that, but this is kind of what I've been thinking about over the past month, and it's really fascinating to see that this is where we left off in the lecture series. Patrick, if you're talking to us, you're muted. Oh, you're talking to us. Okay.
If anyone doesn't have a place to jump off from that part of the conversation, then you can also start with what stood out most about this lecture to you. What was most interesting to you?
Yeah, I'm trying to direct my two children regarding having children. It's like one is playing Fortnite and one is I don't know what she's doing. So good luck with it. As long as they are that calm. One connection could be, which is the big mystery in all of this, I think, or one of the many mysteries, is the so much of what we do ever since we are babies is focused on the ego, and the whole world reinforces that all the time, on building your world view on, and we are asked ever since we are young, what would you like to do when you grow up, and so on, and LinkedIn and sharing all those important. I'm guilty of it too, but one thing I think is highly is very good is his focus on forgetting the ego babble for a while and trying to improve the world. That's a big change, and that can hurt, because you forget what you have. You are asked to forget what you have built on, and maybe still are building on for years. But I find, and that hurts. But it's very good. I try to do it, but it's not easy, I would say.
I felt like there was a maybe a missed piece around the body, like not coming up in this discussion at all. And I mean, to some extent, it's covered by some traditions. Like if you do this in the Indian tradition, you get yoga. If you do it in Taoism, you get qigong. Right? There are physical practices, but Buddhism doesn't have an immediately associated physical practice with it, to me. And there's something I think really, really key about, and I've heard Jamie Wheel talk about this recently, how if you go into these intense mystical experiences without a healthy sense of embodiment, I guess is maybe the way I want to say it, that there's nothing to ground you. There's nothing to channel it through. Like you almost can't absorb the shock of it. And it's funny because it really resonates with my experience, where I had, like, watching John Vervaeke talk about this stuff, it's amazing, because I had this experience this fall where the machinery turned away from self onto the world. My IQ went up, my views changed, like everything changed. And yet I wasn't able to sustain it or develop it because I couldn't remember to eat. I wasn't sleeping. Like the body malfunctioned because it couldn't absorb the change. So I feel like there's something really key about embodiment practices, vagal nerve, all of that stuff, integrating with the mental, emotional, psychological, cognitive, that he doesn't touch on at all.
Yeah. It's like he's describing what flight is, but not describing how to get off the ground necessarily. And there's like what you described, it was sort of this kind of wobbling, like, you know, you're forgetting about all the controls and you get a little bit of takeoff and then you hit again. And as far as I know from the people I've talked to about this subject, it's a pretty normal thing that it's so, the first kind of takeoff is so disruptive that you can even crash. And the things like maintaining the body, there has to be some sort of upregulation of energy if you're to maintain it as well. Meaning you have to eat more. You have to, you have to figure out how to have a higher level of energy input because the brain is doing so much more.
Yeah, where it's interesting because whatever messages, like my body and whatever my brain was doing were in conflict because I was eating less, right? Sleeping less. I was putting less input into the body. Mm-hmm. And then all of this, everything was facing outward. It was like the body was sort of like the like the junker car. I was sort of riding to the edge of the cliff, but it doesn't work that way. Like I can't go buy a new car, so I had to come back into the body. But I'm curious if how much work there has been done around because we separate mind and body, right, in the West. That's why it's become so confusing. But around the body and enlightenment, awakening experiences, and how it is affected, and also how it, like, what role it plays in initiating these experiences as well.
I was thinking about Maslow's hierarchy and felt like that was relevant to this and to another point, that you cannot really put sustained effort and energy into higher levels if you have things missing lower down on the pyramid. And it seems like even culturally we have this sort of salience mapping of what we perceive to be relevant in the physical world. We've optimized for things that are very obviously relevant, and it makes sense to me why we would have lost or ignored any kind of wisdom traditions that would add on to this idea that there's more than just the material, there's more than what you perceive with your senses, and these things are relevant even though they don't necessarily change the physical environment for you. So yeah, I think both points kind of relate. Like, in order to sustain and build, we need to have like the energy, we need to have the foundation, but we also need the wisdom traditions to kind of pull people up and teach them that there is something beyond just the physical, or to use integral theory, beyond the orange level.
Can I just add, I think it's good that you mentioned this, Heather, also, because last year I had to go through a divorce after 20 years. And when starting to Google for information on how to survive a divorce, because it's a massive disruption, nearly everyone, they ground it in physical exercise. That's number one, all over the line. And then there's tips and tricks and the dating and the whatever. But sleeping enough and exercising, that's in every category, I think, no matter from which angle people try to solve this very complex personal problem. Exercise is number one.
Mind if I jump in?
Please, yeah.
Sure. I guess so. With the example of divorce, kind of relating back to what Heather was saying, it's kind of like you're pursuing something that it's gives you some kind of stability, right? Because it's so, those needs might be more basic, sleeping, eating correctly, or maybe not basic, but easier to fulfill. that those, you know, could give you something you could fall back on when everything else is kind of falling apart. That was just kind of something that popped out at me. Seemed like a good entry point.
And back to Maslow's hierarchy, maybe it's once you have those basics, then you can start. At least that was the case for me, to start to meditate and not focus on myself so much, because I had a foundation. But if I was thrown into this and forgot about the sleeping and the exercising and the eating correctly, then the mental and emotional work would be just a mess, I think. So I started in that in that corner.
It's funny too, just speaking from personal experience, how like distracting it is without the relationship and the sex aspect for me, or for guys, or for anyone, I guess. It's just like, it's all consuming until it's a regular supply, and then you're just like, then you can build automatically on the next thing. But it seems like when you're missing those things, it just becomes your 100% focus.
There's another thing that comes to mind here, which is another focus that's been mine for the past couple of weeks, is the notion of suffering and the reduction of suffering. You know, a lot of people feel I've run into a lot of people who've been on the growth path. Is like, I'm done with suffering. I'm no more. I just want pleasure from now on. And it's like, you know, good luck with that. That's there's something about you know, yeah, you can get temporary relief, but the longer you put it off, the harder it's going to become to come back and take that medicine, you know, to grow through that. And there's something like a frame that I had was this continual updating of us, of what's salient, you know, and kind of moving along a path of development. Includes, you know, kind of a deeper capacity to transmute suffering into life, right? Into, okay, how do I deal with this? And something like the suffering really happens when I try to sneak my attachments into the trans self, right? It's like, okay, I just want to keep holding on to this thing, right? And it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. You have to actually let go of it, or if you try to pull it in, there's a pinch there. And so it's a funny kind of a notion to really look into the heart of the fear or pain that I'm experiencing, and to go through to actually welcome that as the sign of the thing that I need to let go of. You know, what are the attachments that are associated with this? Look very carefully at that. What is that thing that's a good place to look at letting go of. I like, Heather, what you said as well about, and switching the mode, it completely changes focus, right? So the body all of a sudden becomes not important, right, for a period of time, until it's like, hey, you can't forget about me. You got to continue to take care of this as well. There's something about it. The image that came to mind was Icarus, and you know, the myth of Icarus and flying high, you know, and melting the wings, right? It's like, you actually have to. It can feel ecstatic to be able to fly. Oh, look, this is great. I'm not constrained by physical means anymore. And then those constraints come crashing back to you in full force. It's an balance.
I wanted to add on to that earlier point I made about the increased energy demands from that transformation. I think that's a relevant thing, because, I mean, the idea of the frame break that John brought up is this, you know, everything becomes unfiltered. You've broken the frame of what you're perceiving, and that requires a lot more conscious energy. Everything is novel, and you're paying attention to everything, so you actually would be consuming more calories just to process what used to be either filtered or automated. So I think that is, I mean, I've never seen any circumstantial evidence for studies about people going through awakening experiences, but I've just seen this pattern with a number of people I've talked to going through it, that it's like there is this sort of depression after, because people don't realize the energy consumption needs after they've completely broken frame. And not just from like a psychedelic experience, but something that becomes stable in your day-to-day life, like something that really persists, and suddenly everything is novel all of a sudden for days or weeks at a time. It's very demanding.
I've noticed that as well. I mean, when going through Vervaeke's course or having these conversations, the glucose consumption, I mean, my brain just like churns through it. It's like, I've got to take a nap. I need to eat something and go to sleep for a little while, because it's like it is burning through that. And there's something that's interesting too. This is, again, kind of breaking away from the lecture a little bit, but looking at our ability as human beings to sort of hack the system, right? To find alternative ways of getting that energy. So yeah, we have high calorie drinks and foods and things. So we can really change the energy consumption, both on an individual body level and also on a cultural level. This ability to pull energy out of the ground in order to fuel our higher energy consumption needs, at the same time that we're becoming more efficient. On the flip side of it, once you stabilize, it's actually like you need less energy consumption for the same work, but you just have an appetite for more work, right?
Yeah, it's almost like the new filters or automations that you install after that awakening happens. It's like they're more consciously chosen, and they're not something you're relying on. Like if you have that process, that self-autolysis thing we've talked about so many times before running, then you're willing to sacrifice any of those new processes to the fire, just like anything else. But it's that old unconscious material that you have to, dig up. It's really difficult. Then throw that, and then everything's novel and frame broken and everything. And what you build after that becomes just, it automates just like anything did before, but you've chosen it and you're willing to break it.
Something that really struck me when talking about novelty and perceiving novelty when you go into this state is how different that is now from, say, like a couple thousand years ago, sitting under a Bodhi tree. The amount of novelty you're processing is a lot different than the novelty of living in a 21st century city with computers and cell phones and, all kinds of demands like that. The bandwidth that's suddenly like thrust upon us, right? When our machinery turns onto the world now, it's a way different world that we're participating in than what was the case when these wisdom traditions were formed, which doesn't mean they can't be helpful, but I think there's a missing, there's something missing because of that change.
It's funny, I don't get the impression that it has become any more difficult, though. And I don't have any evidence for that, but my sense of it is just that there's more gemstones along the path, but the whole idea is to discard all of them. So it's like, it's more difficult to discard like 3 versus 10 if your intention is to discard them all, right?
I think I'm thinking of it in like a body sense, almost like the actual physicality of like absorbing like making 10 gemstones and getting rid of them is takes more than 3.
I like to think of it. I always like to think of it as like the oil in the backyard that has the diamonds and all of the things with the compressed gems in it, but it's spewing out of your backyard, and it's like you can just tap into it and have it go everywhere and catch your house on fire, or you could like take some time to build a rig that can process it. And like, how big is your rig? How much can you process at once? I personally have firsthand experience of going to a 10-day Vipassana and going straight to a mental hospital afterwards because I couldn't process all of the stuff that was coming out of me. So it's like that, I got naked. I felt like I was one with everything. It was fantastic. It was an amazing experience. But then the fallout from that was like, wait, this wasn't like a dream. Like, this is real life. What now? Now I'm stuck in Texas in like a mental state hospital getting fed medication because I didn't have like the right guidance to help me out of a process like that. So it's firsthand, it's you got to be careful with the body trauma. I've had a lot of body trauma, so being able to find the gems in the rough, and being able to get those into things that other people can look at and see, and see the beauty in the experience. It's, I don't know, it's hard to
it's like there's Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He has a term, it's kind of like crazy wisdom. So it's kind of like the idea that you could open to all of this like too rapidly.
Yeah.
Kind of a useful, because I've had the same experience, but it was still from not over a 10-day retreat, but just over like the period of a few months of working at practices. And I feel that there are certain practices maybe have different effects and can maybe open you to more of the explosiveness of reality than other practices. Which there's probably some use to that, but also like if you're not careful, then
yeah, exactly.
Your house goes up on fire, or
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I it's interesting too. And again, noticing the comment on the YouTube thread that you societally we can apply this to transportation, energy, and communications. And it's funny that he mentions those three things, because I was just recently thinking about the fact that Elon Musk is looking at brand new infrastructure on those three primary things. It's like, yeah, transportation, energy, and communications is vastly changing, and the way we think about all of that and the infrastructure we use for that is one thing, but the new capacity coming online can be destabilizing, just in terms of how much more possible a lot of things are, and wondering how to metabolize that, how to really I mean, it's interesting, because in the same way that I think that what's happening when you do the 10-day Vipassana retreat is there's a lot of pent up energy. There's a lot of stored tension in the body that then comes out. And there's a lot of stored societal energy, right? The structure that we have is massive tension, right? We've got this highly stressed system of relationships that allow us to do the thing that we want to. And when we change the friction, we lower the coefficient of friction that allows things to be more efficient, the possibility that these things become unwinding in a really chaotic fashion seems like a high probability. And so this is one of the reasons that I think my comment when I was thinking about this was thinking about Elon Musk, and the part that he doesn't include, or he doesn't include explicitly, are the relational practices. How do we actually deal with the relation to self, to other, to Sangha, in order to notice, am I BSing myself? Is there self deception? Am I grounded? Am I paying attention, or am I just really going chaotically wild? And so in some sense we're unlocking massive treasures in the ability to effectively do magic. I mean, evolutionarily, we have just moved into a world where we're all, I've said this before, but we're baby wizards. I mean, we do have massive power at our fingertips, to the point where Daniel Schmechterberger and Jordan Hall talk about the fact that it only takes a single person to unleash a virus or to make a nuclear bomb. It's like, whoa, we have massive capacity for doing amazing things, and we still have bodily functions that are still trying to process just day-to-day significance, right? So it's a fascinating period where I think it's the reason I'm so excited about the Meaning Crisis lecture series being here, to kind of remind us to look in the mirror and say, oh, this isn't all for free. We actually have to learn to metabolize this.
There's something else too, Jared. You mentioned body trauma, and I think that's another area where the wisdom traditions fall short because it's sort of a newer concept and is much more relevant now, I think, than it was before. Even though people went through just as many or more adverse experiences in their life, that we you know, it was such a different environment that trauma was just a different animal. And that, like, for example, meditation and Buddhism, to my understanding, don't adequately deal with trauma in a lot of cases. And then these kinds of, you know, I don't want to say dangerous, but not helpful situations arise for people. And I feel like there's something that needs to be integrated from some of the newer psychology that's coming out now with the wisdom traditions to have a holistic a way of dealing with trauma and the body, so that, like, that rig is built, like that trauma recovery is a big part of building the rig in the first place.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yep. I'm just joining in from the other room. I wanted to comment because we as animals naturally have mechanisms for overcoming trauma. And so one of those things is our social connectedness. When we are deeply connected to other people, we're able to talk things through, we're able to process things just through the hormonal responses of, you know, oxytocin, for example, of connectedness to other people. We are able to overcome our trauma just in our day-to-day lives, where it doesn't need to be this like process where we have to go to trauma recovery or do some sort of practices that's just naturally built in. But we're so disconnected now from people in modern society that trauma recovery actually becomes something we have to consciously think about. Sorry, I have a crying baby in the background here. And the second thing is that we used to be a lot more active. So when we're physically active, we don't have this buildup of tension that stress creates in the body. And now we spend so much time sitting, we don't move around very much. So this process doesn't happen. So I think those two things are really important. And if we can rebuild those two things in our daily lives, it will make trauma recovery a lot easier.
Hey, Yuvi, I can trade spots for you if you want to come in here for a bit.
Yeah, I think what you just said is both things are really important. I think that it is that you know, with the circling practice, one of the things that we recognize, a lot of people who are attracted to circling as a practice are attracted to it because there is trauma, there is social anxiety, there are a variety of reasons why. You know, it's not a replacement for therapy. There are times when that's appropriate, but there is also something of that we've lost the capacity for deep relating. There's also a part of this that's interesting, which is it's not medicating the trauma, right? It's not covering it up, and there's something, and it's actually metabolizing it. But one of the things that's interesting is when people first come to circling, sometimes it's when a new person is in a communal experience where someone else is expressing distress about something, the temptation is to comfort them, is to help them with that, and it's actually what we discover is that the ability to witness and to be present fully with someone in their trauma is much more an ability for them to learn how to self-regulate and co-regulate, different from let me calm you so that your distress isn't distressing me, right? There's a very clear distinction between those things.
So the group is kind of deciding to face that trauma or that anxiety collectively. you're kind of making space for that in the room. You're allowing that person to work through it themselves, but they do, they have the support. They have other people. They have that ability to find co-regulation to see how other people are taking in that that high energy like output that you're giving out, and they're still able to take it in without the overreaction or the need to dispel the situation, like you were saying.
Right. To be without taking it on as my own responsibility of something that I need to deal with,
Right.
It actually allows each person to recognize that capacity to self-regulate, and the co-regulation happens, I think, in the co-witnessing. It's a really amazing process. It's also interesting that the exercise component that Yuvi mentioned is also very important. It's something I don't know that I don't have a martial arts practice or a physical practice, yoga or anything, but it seems like a relational physical practice, as well as a relational dialogos type practice, would be an essential thing for learning how to really allow things to come up in a more self-regulating way.
Something like, I trained Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I've been doing that for a little over 6 years or so. And a big component of that is you're put in stressful situations. You get a guy trying to put you in a guillotine or something, and trying to take your air away, and like the last thing you want to do is freak out. Because it's like your energy becomes very vital in that situation, becomes even more important that you kind of become more calm and cool and collected, and find a creative way to get out of that problem space that you've been put in. And then you also have like the component of the other person. And they're, a lot of times if you're rolling with someone who's more skilled, they're kind of fitting the proper amount of stress or difficulty to you. So it's like if you're rolling with a white belt or something, if a brown belt or a purple belt's rolling with a white belt, then there's this kind of like fitting that's happening where the brown belt's kind of they're kind of playing with them at their level, maybe just beyond their level.
Yeah, I like that notion as well. That's kind of exactly what I mean, because there's something like taking the practice of sovereignty to the physical level, right? And there's something of really, like you said, balancing all of the various things. Like if you panic, you're actually losing capacity to respond to what's salient, right? Your brain goes into a different state, and you're no longer really present. And yeah, that would happen if you were way beyond your level. But just beyond your level, you can feel that and maintain that. Okay, hold on. The body desires to panic, but I know that doesn't go well, so let me not do that.
Mm-hmm. It's also like you're kind of dropping into the body as well. It's like I had this at a tournament I competed like a couple of months ago, and this guy, I was going for like a type of sweep or something, right? And the guy that I was competing against just reacted to it properly, right? And I thought I was going to get it. And in that moment, because I was so focused on trying to do the one thing, he flips it around, and I'm still in that place while he's transitioning, and suddenly I'm being, choked out. And it's like, because you're still hanging back, thinking that this was going to be the situation instead of dropping into the situation as it is.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to that notion at the beginning that I was talking about. You lose your capacity to actually pay attention to the inputs, right? You're still in the, this is where sovereignty gets to be a problem. You start relying on your presumptions of how the world is, and start filtering out the inputs. And it's like, hold on a second, I really need to be taking the inputs in as well to notice when the situation has changed and it's no longer matching what I think it is. Which the thing that where I think this is profound is looking in the world of business today. In the world of business, we think we understand what's happening, and CEOs and employees and government bodies and everyone thinks that we understand how this works. And it's like, I think it's changing at a rapid rate. I think that the situation is changing so dramatically that we really need to be paying attention to inputs. I started noticing it in the workplace that I was in, when the level of stress on a day-to-day basis and the level of stress was going up and the level of engagement was going down. It's like, if anybody's paying attention to the dials, this is a critical time we need to pay attention. And everybody's like, no, it's just whatever. Yeah, we'll figure it out. We'll do some team building exercises and everything will be fine. It's like, I think we've missed the signal here.
Regarding sense making, just a note, one thing that has helped me tremendously over the years is what's called personal knowledge mastery by Harold Jarkey. So I highly recommend it because the world is increasingly complex, and also when I work in the automotive industry, it's changing like crazy now, and will continue to do that on an exponential scale. But just to make sense of the world is getting harder. So you need those kind of systems to navigate and find the signal in the noise and everything, and know who to rely on and so on. So that has helped me.
I'm curious, like I'm curious about where we are as a group in the call. It feels like we're kind of at an edge. It feels like there's something here that it doesn't feel like this is a conclusion point, but it's like processing, trying to figure out how is all of this. I know that for me, I'm aware that I'm applying this to a lot to outside stuff and really looking at that, but I'm curious how this is applicable. Jared, I'm particularly curious for you. I know that you're working on, you're looking at systems to deal with things like this in this area. So I'm excited for you to be part of the meaning crisis discussions, and I'm curious about what sorts of things are occurring to you in the moment.
Definitely. Well, it's tough for me because I hopped on a little bit late because I was actually in a call discussing this system that I was working on and kind of some other things. But it was, I wanted to get on here and be able to participate as much as possible while only having a little bit of the input from the actual conversation beforehand. So I'm doing my best at this point, just trying to keep my brain on task, focused, and kind of paying attention. And but yeah, I'm going all over the place, my mind. So
I think that's actually a good point, because it's something that and I think, Mike, this is kind of to the point that you were talking about earlier, that we burn a lot more energy. I mean, we're actually dealing with multiple priorities at the same time, at the same moment that we're effectively overhauling the engine mid-flight, right? We're like, okay, there's a lot of stuff happening. I have to rely on my existing protocols and habits at the same time that I'm overhauling them. It's like, wait a minute, is everything here that I'm doing still relevant? I'll mention one other thing that I think is kind of interesting is there is the tendency to want to figure out how to help solve that. I have friends who support Andrew Yang as a U.S. candidate, presidential candidate, because of his universal basic income, and I expressed the concern that I'm not sure that's a good idea, specifically because of the lack of a feedback mechanism. In some sense, it covers over the stress points rather than allowing. It could actually allow people to interact with that. And some people say, well, I've actually done a pretty good job applying myself. And the question is, okay, yes, you have. Are you the norm? This is the asking the university students, do you want lower tuition? It's like, okay, but walk into Walmart and think, okay, I'm going to give $1,000 to each one of the members of Walmart, and is that going to go towards self-development? Probably not. And the question is, how do you, and it's not like, it's an interesting, complex question. And so there's this challenge. The thing that I'm focused on most is how to start something, right? How to focus myself on self-development in a community of self-development that can continue to metabolize that into continued growth. It feels like the amount of pent-up social energy that needs to be metabolized in this way is huge. So building the rig, as you were talking about, Jared, that actually makes this possible to do, which is the kind of the work that I see you doing. Like, okay, how do we actually build that rig that allows us to metabolize in a sustainable way while dealing with increasing complexity?
There's a few points I wanted to say here, and we had talked about this. This is kind of a continuation of our conversation the other day, and me and David were a little bit at odds on this, and you just articulated, I think, what your argument was, and I didn't get to it, but I meant to say this, which is, I feel like basic income would undo the kind of artificial constraints against the average person to be able to just feed themselves and take care of themselves. And in saying that, I mean, like, in tribal societies, we could just walk around and pick something off of a tree and eat it, and we could sleep where we wanted to. Like, we had very basic kind of survival needs taken care of. And in our current system, we're locked into this system of having to work that minimum number of hours just to get everything done. But those hours are increasing all the time. So it's like full-time work now gets us just our eyes above water, not much else, you know? And I come from that position from experience, living in Vancouver and being off and on of employment insurance, and like really struggling to make ends meet, and recognizing that the few times that I had a safety net and was able to like live off of that for a short amount of time, I was putting my energy into something that would build me up. And your answer to that before was what was it again? It was that not everyone's going to do that. Right. That some people are just going to funnel that money straight into something more probably self-destructive or societally destructive. Now, yeah, fair enough. And that's why I think the $1,000 kind of just covers the basic needs. And I think that's what I would hope it would do, is never exceed basic needs. Like, let's all, well, maybe I don't know. I haven't thought that through, but I'm thinking that would be a good place to work up to, is basic needs, where we don't have to do that 40, 50, 60-hour work week just to keep our eyes above water. Now, the second thing I wanted to say was, after I had used that safety net a couple of times and built something, I ended up leaving Vancouver and going into Southeast Asia, bought a one-way ticket and just moved there to continue building that thing, because it was making enough money for me to then leverage my location a little better. So I was there, I was making a couple $100 a month, and was able to keep building it and now put my attention into it full time. And when I was there, I met a lot of people who had read the same set of books that I had, who had the same kind of inspiration to like build something and go travel, and who had suddenly, you know, had all the freedom of time in the world and money in the world that they could possibly use, and suddenly were thrust into some existential crisis of like, okay, now what? You know, I've achieved my dreams, or I've at least achieved like my financial and time freedom. Now what? And I think that kind of pressure is the kind of pressure you might be referring to, like that existential pressure of like, what am I doing here, and what is my purpose here? And it's like a deep depression. But I don't think you can get to that stage if you're constantly, if the system artificially forces you into working 40 hours a week to keep your eyes above water.
It's kind of like you're so busy that you never take the time to realize that, exactly, that the sea that you're actually swimming in, right?
Yeah.
Because I've been in a very fortunate situation where I've been a student for probably like 6-7 years, working, going back to school, but had some, financial support where that was taken care of, where I didn't have to be working all the time. Class time didn't take up all of my time, so I had time to kind of begin to run into some of these problems, like the existential problems, right? And some I've noticed, like even I went to Michigan State University, and in my time there, I noticed a lot of people. It seems the metaphor or the way I always talked about it seems like we're going through like a midlife crisis point a lot early in our lives. So it's like, because I had myself and all of my roommates, literally like I lived with like 4 other guys. And at some point or another in university, every single one of us went through some version of this. It was kind of at different times. But point being, we're all kind of in this position where we had the time where we weren't working, where we weren't caught up in the day-to-day survival where you could run into that problem for better or for worse. For a lot of time, and most of the time, that when you initially run into that problem, it uproots you. You know, I was someone who, and that's kind of like the way that Vervaeke talks about it, like in the Zombies in Western Culture book, with the talks about kind of the umbrella that we're all under, but now we're in a position where the umbrella is unraveled. And so it's when you do run into that existential issue, you don't have any sort of way to frame that. So I guess my worry would be, even if you implemented the universal basic income, and more people could come into these existential problems, or realize what the larger scope problem actually is that all of us have to like come to deal with, that they wouldn't have any sort of way to face that. Like, not everyone has watched John's series, you know, and like I didn't watch it until years after having gone through that. And I went through years of, I mean, I don't want to use the word despair, but it was it was, you know, it's just difficult, very difficult times, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a part here that I think is really interesting, is like the issue. Universal basic income is a specific implementation for something, and I think that it's important to actually notice what it is that we're looking to solve. That the thing that's interesting is like the notion of we're going through the midlife crisis earlier also makes sense, because the amount of meaning that our conventional culture provides for us is becoming bankrupt. We recognize at 20 years old now, wait a minute, this actually isn't going to provide meaning, rather than waiting till 45 or 50 to say, wait a minute, I've done this for 30 years and I'm still not happy. So wait a minute. It's like, no, wait, we can see the bankruptcy out of the gate.
You see it in your parents.
Right. So it's exactly that kind of an insight to see that. But the thing that I think is really tricky is, in the same way that people who used to go through retirement, you know, some people who retire die 6 months later, and some people find a second life where they can really thrive. If people think that satisfaction results in reducing the suffering, they're reducing the stress on me, and they just sit idle, they no longer have purpose or meaning. And the same thing I think is true for people who think that dealing with the midlife crisis is just reducing stress. So just like you were talking about with the grappling, you want to push just beyond your barrier. And it takes a tremendous amount of focus to be able to do that. And this is where I think that something like a dojo, or something like, you know, a life dojo for dealing with that, allows us to say, hey, if you're falling below the level of your competency, and you're not stretching beyond it, you're going to burn out. Your $1,000 is going to, you're actually building dependency rather than sovereignty. Sovereignty happens by stretching beyond that. And so there's something of that part of whatever we do, I think, needs to be incorporated in the feedback mechanism, and collective feedback and reflection on, hey, how are we doing? How are you doing? How am I doing? Are we able to meet that? Are we actually metabolizing that trauma, or are we medicating it?
Right. I guess a lot of it is just to realize like the opportunity of the times that we're living in, where it's like in some sense, it's more possible for you to go through this sort of transformation now than it ever was before. You know, granted, like the ground is it's more difficult to navigate these times. It's also more possible for transformation in this time, just because you can jump into things like this group call, or jump into or do research online and find different available communities. like I live in Denver now. I just moved out here, and you go on meetup.com. There's any number of different meditation groups that you can join up, different communities where people are pursuing meaning, pursuing relationships, meaningful relationships with other people, which I think is probably that's probably the most important thing in meaning in life, right? Is and I got somebody at my door here, so I'm gonna jump out of the conversation for a second, but thank you.
Yeah, I think that's actually really interesting. Somebody had said, in looking at technology, that boy, if I could only go back to the early 1980s or the 1990s, and when all of this internet and computer technology was just taking off, just think of how much money I could make investing in it. But at the time, nobody realized how that was, and they said, actually, now is a much better time to jump in. If you think the opportunity was great then, it's nothing compared to the opportunity that's here now. This is a much more fertile environment for innovation and creativity. So I think that's a lot of what you're saying, Tony. That's just like the possibilities for transcendence, transformation, application in novel ways is higher than ever, and the stress is higher as well. So it's almost hard to kind of look away from my control panel just long enough to notice, okay, wait a minute, what's actually happening around me?
There's a quote that John says at some point in the series when he's talking about the I guess basically the process of relevance realization. It's, you can there's either the spiral downwards or there's a spiral upwards, right? And I always end up coming back to that. Even though we live, and it kind of applies to the social circumstances we find ourselves in as well. It's like even though we have these great opportunities, you can still get lost in the internet of bullshit, right? There's, you just go on Reddit and stare at memes for 12 hours a day and like not do anything productive if you really wanted to. Or you could even use Reddit. You use the same website, and then there's any number of different like meaningful communities you can jump into and become a part of the discussion, or you can figure out how to dress yourself better, or take care of your hair better, or like literally anything. So it's but I guess it just always comes back to the individual person, and where they're at on that spiral.
I really like what you said about meaningful relationships as being the most important thing that we can kind of seek out in terms of our experience. I'm that's kind of where my headspace is at right now. Of like, if we could incentivize society to do something, what would that be? And like, David was talking about the good, the true, and the beautiful, and that kind of resonated with me a lot last conversation. So I started thinking about that within the system, but just having that neighbor. Like, I found out my next door neighbor right here is a music producer. He's into computer science, and he like has been there's so many things that like he's into like Dungeons and Dragons too, which I'm just getting into. I'm like, this guy's like going to be my best friend, and he lives right next door. Like, this is awesome. Like, why have I just found out about that right now? Like, is there a way that we could incentivize people to find out about more meaningful connections that they could be making with people around them? Because that would really enrich your experience.
I think it really comes down to the pond you're fishing in. It's like if you find a place where, I'm not sure where you live, that your neighbor just happens to have a lot of similar interests. It could be that he moved to the city for the same reason at some point. There's kind of like Denver is kind of a hub right now. There's a lot of young people that are moving here pursuing a lot of the same similar career paths. You end up meeting people that are, they moved here for the same reason. They moved from similar states to here. Like, there's so many people. I'm from Michigan. There's so many people from the Midwest that are all like moving out here. But for me in particular, I guess like the one that I think the most of is like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I can drop into any gym in the country, and I'll instantly make meaningful connections with people, because in some regard, like every single person that's in that gym that's been there for more than 6 months has like committed to this thing that they really highly value. And a lot of it boils down to they're there to better themselves. So it's I guess it would be meeting people that mutually want to become better people. Right. And then if you have similar interests, that's icing on the cake. But like, just the grounds of meeting people that also want to see themselves become better people, to see the world become a better place to live in, and have that sort of not like ultimate naive positivity, but like just a bright future is kind of on their horizons, right? That's what they're looking towards.
It's infectious. I mean, when you're around in an environment with people like that, you can't help but feel that, and like you want to be around that. And I feel it's like a net positive kind of interaction of emotion. Like I was thinking about emotion as well, and like how that is like free energy from in society. Like we're talking about, if we're looking for like free energy, me giving you a positive outlook or experience or emotion or happiness, you walk away from that being like, yes, like that was awesome. Like, oh my gosh, like everybody, you know, smiling and feeling good. Like that's infinite. Like we could just, I mean, that's love, really, when it comes down to it. But like, how do we maximize that in society? Because that, like, can we incentivize people to feel that way? Like, I don't know, man. It's stuff I'm thinking about a lot, but yeah.
Yeah, I've kind of stepped away. I used to always think about like trying to think of things from the top down level, but I'm not smart enough to figure it out. Like,
no one is, man.
Easier to work on the bottom up.
Yeah. Nora Bateson would totally agree with you on this. She's been talking about lately how much people are trying to incentivize from the top down, like create systems that everyone can fit into, and she's like, it's really not the way big social change happens. You have to start at the bottom. You have to start in little communities and have people spread it themselves. It's kind of like the same idea of what we think collective intelligence is. Like we think we have to influence the collective to do something. And by participating in collective intelligence, it means we all have to have the same shared Trello board or something like to organize us all. It's like, really, no, the collective intelligence is happening whether you are influencing it or not. It's happening. And the best thing you can do to influence it is to do your own thing, to be the best version of yourself.
Just participate. And
then influence others in the network to do the best version of themselves. It's really bottom up. But speaking of Nora Bates, and this might be actually a good place to wrap up, we're doing a Q&A with her tomorrow, same time as this one. So if you guys want to come in and ask questions, you're welcome to.
I'll be fully prepared for that one.
Cool.
Great. I also have a book recommendation that John mentioned a few courses ago. Waking from Sleep by Steve Taylor. Excellent book on practical guidance on explaining what a high state of consciousness is, and how many people have experienced the different levels of it, from all the way from nirvana to just feeling a bit off. Is the whole spectrum. So I'm maybe a third way into the book, and it's just excellent. So Waking from Sleep, very good advice from John.
What was the author again?
Steve Taylor, Taylor.
Okay.
Waking from Sleep.
I've added that to the show notes if you guys want to see it in the future. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks, guys, for joining. This is fun. I'm glad we're doing this again.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks again, guys.
All right. See you next week.
Talk to y'all later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.